Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Brett Scharfs. I'm the director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this afternoon session on artificial intelligence and innovation and human dignity. For me, it's a special memory to be here in the Riggs Library. I was an undergraduate at Georgetown University, and one of the most important mentors in my life was the Reverend Timothy S. Healy, S.J., who was the president of Georgetown University. In the room where we were standing and having lunch, that was the largest portrait in the room. I hope you'll notice it on your way out. He was a giant of a man, physically, intellectually, morally, spiritually. And if you corner me, I can regale you with stories about him, one of which happened right here in the middle of this room, which was one of the most memorable experiences of my life. I was also in this room when Justice William Brennan gave his famous speech on the living Constitution, which became almost an entire school of jurisprudence based upon that important speech that he gave. This university and the Jesuits who run it were a really important part of my development, and I'm really indebted to the education I received here and the moral formation that I received here. I'm grateful for this topic. We live in a moment when artificial intelligence seems to be on everyone's mind. It seems to be the topic of every other op-ed that we read in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and probably every other periodical that we read. Just yesterday, there was a very important document released by Pope Leo XIV, Magnificat Humanitas. I'm going to read a paragraph from that in just a minute. This topic and this paper that Mariana has drafted, I think is really significant, and I'm glad that it's a part of the priorities for the G20 this year. And the draft that we have in front of us is, I think, a really good draft, and we're looking forward to our panelists' feedback on it, and also looking forward to your suggestions about it as well. Let me find this excerpt I want to read. This is paragraph 15 of the encyclical that came out yesterday from the Vatican. Pope Leo writes, "In the era of artificial intelligence, when human dignity is threatened by new forms of dehumanization, ours is the pressing duty to remain profoundly human. We must lovingly safeguard the grandeur of humanity bestowed upon us and revealed in its fullness in Christ, the splendor of which no machine can ever replace." What a remarkable statement near the beginning of Magnificat Humanitas. Mariana is the principal author, and as with other papers, we're going to give her a couple of minutes just to summarize and tell us a little bit about the drafting of the paper. And then we're going to turn the time to John Havens for 4 or 5 minutes of reflections, then to David Saperstein for 4 or 5 minutes of reflections, and then back to Mariana, who's also a panelist today, for 4 or 5 minutes of reflections. And we'll follow the protocol of asking each of our participants to begin by introducing themselves. And so Mariana, since you're going to be speaking twice, before you begin your summary, could you just start by introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm Mariana Richardson, and I'm also the Director of Communications for G20 Interfaith Forum. I also am a professor at Brigham Young University teaching in business. It has been very interesting. I do teach about AI at the university. And so I have really enjoyed also looking at this as AI and faith. And one of the things that I wanted to start with in terms of about this paper is that I did not do this alone. As a matter of fact, John here, I'm just so glad that John's able to be here with us. John helped as a co-writer of this paper, as well as Will Jones, who's with the Future of Life Institute. Future of Life Institute is the oldest AI pro and negative, and that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about. I have a feeling we're going to be saying a lot of the negative things about AI today, but I do want to put in a plug and an important plea to say all of us use AI every day. It is a part of our life. We're not going to get rid of it, but we have to decide how we're going to use it and how it's going to become a part of our society. That is the question. So as we start, I would also say I had the wonderful opportunity to talk to a lot of religious leaders. And if you notice, I have a good 10, but one of the things about this paper is it's already out of date. I finished it, just a few weeks ago, and already, as to what happened yesterday, I'm going to have to add other things. Also, there's constant, in terms of best practices. I was just talking to some people the other day. We were at a meeting with some cryptologists who were talking about other best practices that need to be put into place. So there's all kinds of things that I need to add to here. And so as we talk today, realize this is going to be an ongoing project to be able to understand what we need to do for best practices, but also recommendations. As we talk about recommendations, I also, as you read through this paper, realize that the recommendations are also recommendations from other people as well. These are recommendations that were taken from T20's paper on artificial intelligence. It's also taken from the World Council of Churches, from Article 18 Alliance, from a variety of other different AI recommendations that have been done. And so realize we're trying to bring these all together to show that together we're also concerned about this. I would like to say too, when we talk about, we've talked a lot already about how difficult our world is in terms of coming together, having consensus. And when we talk about the religious world, oftentimes that's something that we also stress. But I would like to say, as I've talked to different people in different faiths about AI, there does seem to be some consensus about concerns. And there's consensus about concerns in terms of the world, but also in terms of youth and also individuality. So when we talk about the world, some of the concerns that people have is the idea of what is humanity? The basic question of what is human and how do we define personhood? But also the environment, our planet, how is that going to be affected by AI? Some other things that are concerned about youth is, of course, education, and also this idea of relationships. How are we having relationships in AI that is taking away from the human? And then finally, individuality. A lot of concern about freedom of religion and belief, a lot of concern about the idea of my privacy and my personal data being taken by other people. All of these are issues that are also talked about in a faith context. So we will be discussing that today. So I think that's kind of a pretty good summary of some of the major issues that we'll be talking about.
All right, thanks, Mariana. John?
Yeah. I got to start with just saying I am so overjoyed to be here. And through God's grace, I guess someone could make it on the panel. And Mariana, through her kindness, because I've just gotten involved in this project, I got to be here. So I'm going to take a risk and give an international language. It's the beginning of my talk. Because I think a lot of times the focus is on what can divide. But also I like bringing up this example. If you were to prompt Gen AI and say, teach me how to play blues harmonica, what would it say? If you had practiced for 40 years to learn how to play blues harmonica, and you were on Broadway as a former actor, and you played in hundreds of bars around the world when you go to speak in Dubai, in Japan. And for the sound person, beware, you might want to turn this down a tiny bit. Here's this offering. Thank you very much.
Hard act to follow.
So besides knowing as an actor, you got to wake
the
people.
The pressure is really on me now.
Enjoy.
Good luck, David.
I have an oboe backstage if you play. Besides the old acting trick of knowing after lunch, you got to wake people up. I wanted to start with that, and I'm kind of moved because I really do feel blessed to be here. It's easy to forget that as a human, and I've worked now in AI ethics for about 12 years, that you all have worth. That's my belief. And I believe most faith-based traditions, the thing that we often don't say enough, especially to young people. And I was at Davos and spoke, and I said, these 5 words you may not hear anywhere else. So I'm saying this as John. I was raised in a Methodist tradition. When I say I believe Jesus, I mean I studied the New Testament scriptures as well as the Jewish scriptures. Know that Jesus was Jewish. And what I actually believe from a historical context, reading some Greek and Aramaic and etc., was here was a person that met people where they were and said, I love you. The story of the woman at the well of Samaria was not a story about a woman who had done something wrong. It was a story about, because if you actually know the Gospels, Jesus, there's more verbiage spent with Jesus talking about the woman at the well of Samaria, which is essentially, from my understanding, correct me, my Muslim friends in the room, but it's an Abrahamic center archaeologically. But the whole point of that story is, I love you so much, and I want to restore a relationship with Dad, with Yahweh. I want to bring you back into relationship and love. So you may be saying, I thought you were going to talk about artificial intelligence. But I wrote a book in 2016 called Heartificial Intelligence, Embracing Our Humanity to Maximize Machines. Because the more that I've studied about human values, one thing that's often ignored is this statement that I said in Davos: you are worthy of love. I've been in rooms in Beijing and Tokyo and this city many times, or DC I should say, and then so many places talking about AI principles and this, but a lot of times I leave and there's no mention of love. And so I'm kind of going off book of my notes, but I'll say this from the last panel. If you studied GDP, which I have for years, well-being economics, and you know the Stiglitz Commission in 2009, Amartya Sen, Stiglitz, President Sarkozy from France at the time said, is GDP the best measure of societal progress? And the answer overwhelmingly was no. But the thing, and I'm quoting verbatim, if you look at what they said, one of the paragraphs said, it's easier to measure human well-being than GDP. That doesn't mean GDP is bad. But a core thing to remember that the GDP was not built to measure in Bretton Woods after the Second World War was caregiving, which by and large means how women are treated and children around the world. In terms of justice, it was never built in. And the second thing is nature. So I bring all this up because as we talk about artificial intelligence, and I will go in depth about hyperscale data centers and how they use water and energy and how the infrastructure around just Gen AI, one application of AI systems, is prioritizing all these economic things that actually we don't necessarily need. So some other quick points that were in my notes, but again, I felt led to play harmonica. Enjoy. What religious traditions have brought to us is an understanding of the sacred nature of Scripture. From my understanding, again, from Jewish cultures, because I call myself Jewish plus as a Christian, oral tradition, when you memorize the Talmud, it wasn't like, I'm pretty sure it said, Bob talked to Steve. Like, you memorized every jot and tittle of every nuance of every sound, because these were your ancestors. These were the 12 tribes. These were Abraham. You didn't mess up the words because they were the songs and the spirit of your faith. But today, if you don't know all the, I'm not trying to focus on the errors, but to say what can religion bring? A call for a sacred exactitude of words. Because Gen AI has, I don't like this term, it's what's called anthropomorphic, which means attributing human characteristics to something that's not alive. AI is not alive. It is not sentient. That is something key in the encyclical yesterday Pope Leo talked about. Please read it. But is to say, if the words meant something, why shouldn't we hold them on our heart? Why wouldn't they be written on our heart? And the same thing is with what I call ground truth of the original documents. That right now, if you don't verify what you use with AI or Gen AI, then it is creating what is called synthetic data. The term which I don't like is AI slop. But I bring this up to say that what can religions offer? The call for exactitude of the original human words written. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them. But in terms of agreeing among multiple faiths, if we can't go back to the source documents of anything we create in the scientific corpus and say that actually existed, look where we are. The spirit of the authors of these books. And if you want to open one up and look at it, do that, because there's probably legal books here. Where just in Oregon last month, lawyers for multiple, this has happened multiple times in the last 3 or 4 years since since November 2022 with OpenAI, ChatGPT. Multiple times, lawyers are citing cases that never existed because of Gen AI, one application. Anyway, I think my 4 minutes are probably almost up, so I'll wrap up by saying this. There's an idea, if you know applied AI ethics, which means studying things like deontological ethics or utilitarianism, but especially virtue ethics. In the West, the Aristotelian traditions and the Western ethical traditions largely focus on rationality. I think therefore I am, and our brains are beautiful. I believe God, Yahweh, calls us to use our brains. But in the Ubuntu ethics tradition, which is an indigenous or a global majority, I recommend that term, right? Global majority versus minority, etc., is the beautiful phrase, I am because we are. And if you put those two together, then I believe we have the personhood that I will be so bold as to say any creator has imbued us all with, which is our beautiful brains, but also the existence of consciousness that only comes in community and communion with each other. That is actually how we exist. Does a tree make sound if it falls in the woods and no one's there here to listen, right? That's the physics of the idea of relationality. And without relationality, let's call it what it is, Silicon Valley influenced, trillionaire and billionaire influenced, rationality driving Gen AI and the hyperscaler infrastructure that are really determining the future of the planet will not keep us safe, will not bring us together. And that's the call that I believe we have today.
Thank you, John. David, will you introduce yourself and give us some feedback on the draft?
Shall do. That was great, John. Thank you very, very much. And I thought all of the papers, all of them, were really good. This one I really thought was exceptional and really appreciated the work that all of you put into it. My name is David Saperstein. I am the Senior Advisor for Strategy and Policy for the Reformed Jewish Movement in North America, the largest denomination. I taught at Georgetown Jewish law and church state law for 35 years at the law school. And I am, amongst other things, co-chairing a World Economic Forum project, one of its global future councils, that is dealing with faith in action on 3 issues: moral economy, climate change, AI and ethics, exactly the three issues that we're here today. And I reached out to Tom this morning to say we really got to find a way to exchange a lot of the thinking on. I'm going to open just with one line from our draft paper at this time to set the context that societal impact of AI is unfolding along several fault lines. They're familiar to you: algorithmic bias, opaque decision-making, privacy violations, energy-intensive models, the rise of personal AI agents that may reshape identity, memory, and tradition. A parallel concern in the disproportionate influence of dominant cultural, economic, and geopolitical perspectives on how AI is designed and how it is deployed, raising concerns of exclusion, marginalization, injustice, and unsustainable futures. We're witnessing the emergence of a radically transformative tool without an agreed moral framework or code of ethics to guide its development. Oz's observation about being honest about the differences, I would say, is less applicable in this area here, that there is an overwhelming consensus. I'm going to focus on Jewish values that are at stake in this, but they're not going to end up being different from many that I have heard from a whole variety of traditions as well, in terms of what the values and the goals ought to be. So buckle up, here we go. A number of Jewish perspectives relevant to this. First, the one that was already mentioned by both Jenny and Eric this morning, this idea of B'Tselem Elohim. Here, the idea that we're creating the image of the divine and the inherent dignity that goes along with that. And that animates the way we think about AI and its impact on human autonomy, on human free will, on human dignity, and on the dignity of work that is attached to dignity as well. Secondly, human values and characteristics that our respective traditions value. The value and the recognition of what makes us distinctively human. Here, kindness, a sense of wonder and awe, the capacity to love, compassion, empathy. We can teach an LLM how to talk as though it sounds empathetic. We've yet to be able to come close to conceiving of what it would look like to have a machine that empathizes. Here, and the distinguishing characteristic of maintaining that which is human and protecting it however we developed AI remains crucially vital. Third, the idea of equality, derived in Judaism from the Aggadic stories that ask the interpretations of the Bible that ask why we all descended from one couple, from Adam and Eve. Why was Adam made of the dust of the four corners and the four colors of the earth? So none of us could say our ancestors had more merit than anyone else's ancestors. We're all brothers and sisters here, all linked together. And the related idea of justice, tzedek, tzedek tirdov, justice shall you pursue, or tikkun olam, the mandate to help perfect the world, the special concern that we have for the vulnerable, for the elderly, for the children. And children clearly is a concern that all of our faith traditions bring to bear in the evolution of LIA and taking protective measures for the vulnerable. But that concern about the widow and the orphan, the poor, always that pervasive preference that God has to protect the poor animates so much of this. And we've heard many manifestations of that, the need to share with the global South the benefits of this and to take them into consideration for, with all due respect, the white Gen Z males in California who are designing these things may have very little in common or understanding of what the actual applicable needs are of the farmer in India or the indigenous community in South America here, et cetera, and finding ways to join that becomes crucially challenging and important for us. And this requires an active elimination of bias in AI systems, a fair distribution of AI's benefits and burdens. Here, the the accountability mechanisms when AI makes discriminatory application in structures in terms of what is at work here. And so too the idea of in Judaism, and I'm sorry this didn't come up more in the first session here, there is no idea of caveat emptor. There was extensive regulation, both in the Bible, but certainly by Talmudic times, the first centuries of the Common Era. Here, significant regulation of the economy, in some ways far more extensively than we know today. The rule of the 1/6, that a fair market value 1/6 above or beyond should set the limits of what a fair exchange was, or the sabbatical cancellation of debts that we heard about this morning from Eric, or the jubilee restorative justice he alluded to here. All kinds of rules and regulations. So too, protection of the environment, protection of the water and the air, protection against pollution in great detail in the Talmud and in the medieval codes of the Jewish people. So too about health. All things relevant here. Protection of the environment, economic justice and fairness, protection of health, all of those woven together in terms of concerns that in the evolution of AI we have to be concerned about. I don't have time to go into it, but you ought to know that by the medieval period, even early medieval periods, there was a developed set of laws dealing with copyright materials, and some of the debates that are going on in clergy associations today, not just in the Jewish community, but in every religious group about, wait a minute, if you're going to pull stuff that you pulled down from Claude, do you have to credit Claude in your sermon and acknowledge it? Here, I actually have an answer to that if you ask me during the Q&A of what a guideline may be, but all of those debates are going on as well. Judaism clearly set up a system and concern about privacy that was not the property-oriented version of privacy that animated early Anglo-American law, really until the 1960s, where it changed to a personality, or did someone have a reasonable expectation of privacy based on what a human being would have, rather than property rights. Judaism had that early on. And a whole set of rules against overhearing and overseeing, and those were torts that were actionable here because it offended the human dignity of each person there. Let me just say, you get the idea of what I'm saying, that these are not distinctively Jewish applications. These values I'm hearing in every one of the presentations, and that I've read in the literature from different faith traditions as well. It doesn't mean that over the question of the role of corporation and corporate accountability, there may not be differences amongst some of the traditions. There will be some differences here, but in the main, there's a lot of agreement on what needs to be protected. And I give the Pope enormous credit for making it clear. Let just paraphrase the remarkable Brian Hare here. In a world in which technology allows us to do almost everything, what we should do, the moral question, is a fundamental question facing humanity. The Pope added to that, what we should not do is also as fundamental a question to that in terms of this. So I really commend the paper's summation at the end of the different criteria that ought to be judged about it. I'll simply add a couple of others that weren't on this list. You could go check the list yourself here, but above all, developmental transparency. Here, I would remind you that in Judaism, in all the debates over everything, you look at the Talmud, every page is filled with minority and majority opinions, all recorded for history. The rabbis believing that what was a minority opinion today might, as our ethical senses developed or the world changed, seem to be later a controlling, preferable opinion here. That things have to be tested for the sake of safety and health, really tested rigorously before they be applied. And it ought to be deployed gradually here in this mad rush to be first. and competition with China, competition amongst the corporations. We really have to be careful that we don't move so fast. Here, we all know technology moves faster than our ethics do, but we want to make sure it doesn't move faster than our ability to control it is here. And the paper talked about the need to keep under human control, and the Pope asserted this too, weapons decisions, anything dealing with, ought not to be autonomous weapons with no human control. I would add beyond weapons, that defaulting towards human control, particularly as it's developing, becomes crucially important. And finally, the idea of accountability. There will be harms, and setting up a system and a regulatory system that ensure that harms can be adjudicated and act as a deterrent about it, because otherwise it is a Wild West and there will be no restraints on it. And the rule of law, so central to the Jewish tradition, so central to all of our traditions, is again a crucial reminder of the balance that needs to be had. Judaism always embraced science from early on. So why so many of the great medieval scholars were doctors here, embracing scientific advances. God gave us the ability from natural things, we're told in our text, to make medicines. The failure to do it is a sin against God and against humanity, to use that human wisdom about it. But putting ethical constraints on it that are enforceable becomes pivotal in terms of the success of how to apply this transformative technology that offers so much good, and yet the potential damage, if it goes wrong, can really end history in a way that is unprecedented in human history before.
Thank you, David. Mariana, back over to you.
Thank you. I think this is so interesting. Like I said, I knew that we were going to be talking a lot about the negatives, but I do want to just also kind of underscore the positives. I mean, I think that the AI technology is so much a part of so many things that we do in a day that sometimes we don't even realize how much it is there. But given that, yes, we do need to be careful and we need to be aware. And I think that's the number one thing, is that things are happening so fast in AI. And the whole idea of agentic AI, which wasn't a reality but is becoming more and more so a reality. How do we handle an AI that is acting like a person, going out in terms of business, in terms of becoming a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or all these other ways that AI is being used in a way that oftentimes faith would say it shouldn't be used in that way. And so the other thing that I wanted to talk about that we really haven't said about, has been mentioned previously, is this idea of the global south and what is happening with AI in the global south. I was very interested with the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He said that he wants to make sure that AI does not mean advancing inequality. And I thought that was such a strong statement that we have to be aware of, that is one of the problems. It is definitely having those that have versus those that have not. That disparity between those two is becoming greater and greater because of artificial intelligence. When we were in South Africa, one of the most profound statements that was made was by a South African that is an AI. And he said, my frustration is that I just don't have the tools to do what you do in terms of AI. But I'm just as smart as you are. And if you gave me the tools, I could do just as much or more than what you're doing with AI. And I thought he was true. It's true. We need to also make sure, and that's something that the UN is very much a part of. The end of January, the UN is having an open AI conference at the UN. And then at the beginning of July, they're having an AI governance summit that's going to be happening in Geneva. In both of these events, what they're trying to do is to open this up into a much more global conversation, but also to make sure that there is governance that is happening with voices from all over the world, not just United States dominance. And so the one thing that I did want to stress, I did thoroughly enjoy reading the Magnificat Humanitas last night. And the thing that really struck me was at the beginning, the Pope used two wonderful images from the Bible. The first one is the Tower of Babel. And he said, in the Tower of Babel, we saw the limits of any effort that is grandiose, that arises from self-affirmation, sacrifices human dignity for efficiency, and aspires to reach heaven without God's help. And then he contrasted that with the rebuilding of the walls in Jerusalem. And he said, in Jerusalem, they rediscovered community and harmony that arises when persons assume their own roles and recognize their strength that comes from the Lord. And for me, this was fascinating because basically the question is being asked, which one are we going to be? Are we as society going to go down the Tower of Babel path, which means more and more disunity? Or are we going to come together and as a world group decide how we're going to use this ethically and to help all mankind, not just a few? The other thing that really struck me, yes, I would say all of you should read it. It is very readable too. That's what I really enjoyed. It was just so well done. But there's of course the 10 chapters on all the different things that he's talking about. But the end was the one that just really touched me. He said, let us become weavers of hope. And I love that image, weavers of hope. This is not something that we need to be doomsday sayers and saying, oh, everything's going to be terrible and, everything like we know it. I was talking to someone just the other day at the ICNA. We were with this wonderful group of Muslims, and one of the things that was talked about was how some of the verbiage is that just the normal people will become serfs, and then we'll have this feudal system all over again. That's not what I want to see our future to be. I want us to see us all working together to make sure humanity as a whole is able to use this tool. And that's what it is. It should be used as a tool. It is not to supplant humanity, but it's here to help us. The other thing that he said is, in the humble fidelity of daily life, even the era of AI can become a time in which the Holy Spirit brings about the civilization of love in our lives. And for me, that is the essence of what I'm hoping when we talk about faith in action, that as we look at AI and things are happening at a crazy rate in terms of the things that are going on and the issues that we as people of faith are going to need to hit head on. I would challenge you to read some of these recommendations and to think, we have recommendations for religious and interfaith communities. Two particular was that of developing AI curriculum to teach AI literacy and responsible use of AI. And I was really interested in the New York Times article about this Magnificat Humanitas, because the very end was a technologist who made this statement. He said, the tech bros are not going to do anything about this. But he said this was really written for people of faith, and that we need to take it to people of faith, parents who need to know what should they be teaching their children to do with AI. Many of them don't know what to do, but to give them an understanding of the issues, the problems, the positives, the negatives, so that they can go and teach their children. The other one is to establish benchmarks, specifically for religious traditions. And this has been done a lot lately. We've seen this, especially in the Jewish community. Evangelicals, at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is putting in a multi-faith benchmark group that is really working hard on this. And this is an opportunity for faith communities to develop benchmarks that will require AI models answer queries about religious traditions from the consensus of the adherents. And this is really important. If you, I will just end with one personal story. I like to play around with AI, I have to admit, just to see the limits. And so I asked it, just do a simple query. And I said, I listed a bunch of different faiths. And I said, all right, tell me what these different faiths believe in terms of AI. I got a lovely summary, 3 or 4 pages, and I read it through, and knowing myself, a lot of the background, most of it was wrong, actually completely wrong. And so I went back and I said, okay, and this was Claude 5, it was the latest Claude. And I said, all right, I want you to go back. I want you to find reputable sources. I gave it a very strong query of exactly what I wanted. Claude came back and apologized and said, I am so sorry for my first answer. I had not done sufficient research. I had just gone out and just gotten general what was out there on the internet. And this is one of the big concerns when it comes to faith, is that if you ask faith questions, it will just come back with wrong information. And so we must be vigilant to make sure that when people are asking those questions, they're getting the right answers. So thank you.
Thanks, Mariana.
Is it okay to respond or?
Sure, go
Okay.
ahead.
Just because, thank you for letting me respond, because I didn't actually tell you where I work and all that, and I'm on recording. So in 2016, I wrote this book, and then I went to IEEE, the world's largest professional technical association, over 500,000 members in over 190 countries. And I'd asked, doing a series of articles for The Guardian, is there a code of ethics for AI? I couldn't find one. And the Future of Life Institute had one of the first set of AI principles in 2015. IEEE, having engineers and systems thinkers, we put together this big document called Ethically Aligned Design. We did 3 versions. Over 700 people touched it over 3 years. It was used as a foundational 400-page compendium by UNESCO, UN, dozens of companies, including IBM. It's cited in hundreds of papers, and we created the largest suite of applied AI ethics standards in the world. So I didn't say any of that. And because the reason is, and Mariana made so many good points, and thank you, by the way, Selah, for what you said, David. Isn't that the right term in the Psalms? Selah. Yeah. I'd love to echo one thing you said. It is critical to move beyond this idea of doomsdayers and whatever else. And I was on a panel with someone a couple weeks ago and came up with the term loomers instead of doomers, because using the idea of weaving. The exactitude of the technologies, first of all, some just core things I wanted to make sure to say. AI, as your husband could say more than anybody in the audience, Steve, has been around since 1956 at Dartmouth. It's a marketing term. The guy who created the term artificial intelligence, it was a marketing term in relation to cybernetics at the time. That doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that there are so many techniques. For me, saying artificial intelligence is like saying the internet or the air. It's too broad a term. So one thing engineers are very good at is saying, what's the scope? What do you actually mean? So Gen AI is one application which uses this idea of prompting, right? The reason it's so powerful is that in November 2022, it became publicly easy for people to use a type of AI. Large language models gather massive amounts of data, and this is not critiquing, it's how they're built, but it's critical in this environment to know for faith-based traditions. When you bring together massive amounts of data and then you summarize, any summary has bias. Bias does not make it evil, but as David pointed out, if you don't say what the bias is, then you will actually be producing things that are misinformation. A critical danger, there's things called hallucinations, which is what's called anthropomorphization. The framing that I wanted to mention that Mariana pointed out, and the reason I talked about caregiving, is the term that I would also love all of us to never say again without context or at all, is don't hinder innovation. This is a word that's essentially a spell. It's an incantation. If you say it in a room, it means, hold on, don't frame anything we're going to talk about and anything except GDP measures of productivity that say that's what societal progress is. I don't read in the Talmud, when I've read it, the English translation, sorry, I don't read Hebrew, but that God or Yahweh or Allah says, you know what's most important, my children? Productivity. Productivity and speed. You know what I don't say? I spent time with my kids last weekend. I was with them 3 hours, and then yesterday I spent time with them for 2 hours. I'm more efficient. Efficiency and productivity are not the main reasons we were created. Dilexit Nos is an encyclical by Pope Francis I highly recommend you read. Talks about love and caregiving, but the specific aspect of why it is not squishy, why it's often called squishy, is because guess what wasn't mentioned at Bretton Woods? Caregiving. If we prioritize caregiving, we can move beyond this idea of don't hinder innovation, and we can say, let's increase care. Because when, for instance, when someone saw, when ChatGPT was first released, here's what you saw, but you didn't really read, respectfully, is at the bottom of that white box, which is a beautiful UI, and I was an EVP of a top 10 PR firm, so I understand the need to keep you glued to your screens because it increases dopamine, and then you can't leave because of the chemical aspects of your brain. You know what it said under that box? And it still says well below the fold, ChatGPT can make mistakes, check important info. Someone says, well, humans make mistakes, and then my answer is, would you ride in an elevator that said, this elevator may make mistakes, check important info? And if someone's like, it's not the same thing, my answer is, it is exactly the same thing. And it was released purposefully to not have you think about that. But then the second it says, I think you should do this, and it uses your name. If you know the science of anthropomorphism, because yes, all humans anthropomorphize. We think our teddy bear is real when we're kids. But when it's used as a design technique, then that means you stay glued to it. Care just simply means saying, hey, it's not alive. Enjoy. But yesterday, if you didn't see it, I watched it. I woke up at 5:30 in the morning and watched the encyclical. One thing about Claude, and I speak for myself, anything I say today is not what my IEEE, my employers would say necessarily. But Claude and a lot of the Gen AI ideas about saying these tools are real, be clear, it is market theater, because the tools are not sentient. They're not alive if you design them. If you choose to believe them, I'm not here to say that your subjective truth is not your own. But the critical reason, if you actually look at what Claude calls their constitution, and I read a brilliant article about this for the lawyers in the room. If you know about avoiding, and thank you for your patience, about avoiding litigation, if you were to say this cup is alive and someone says it isn't, you could take me to court. If I say this cup isn't alive, then you face a lot of, like, why do I care about Claude? I thought it was alive. If you say this cup might be alive and it's emerging, guess what you get to avoid? You get to avoid any form of accountability. And you get to charge clients for mythos and tell them that your tool is better than all. So I bring this up to say, kind of echoing what you just said, exactitude, empiricism, understanding what the tools are. This is not doomsdayism, nor is understanding how water is actually used at hyperscalers. This is a way of saying, our Creator gave us these things to steward, including the mental health of our youth and our planet. Knowing about these things is a glorious opportunity, not to hinder innovation and profit, but to prioritize the planet and people. Thanks for letting me go off the book there.
All right. I have a brief question for each of our panelists, and I'm going to open it to the floor. I have begged our panelists to be brief in their comments, and I will renew my plea.
That's to me, and I appreciate that.
No, it's not specifically to any one person. David, my question to you has to do with accountability. You mentioned accountability in your comments, and you're a law professor, as am I, and so I've been wondering lately about artificial intelligence and the companies that are creating these various applications. And I'm wondering whether our legal system and its normal means of accountability are up to the task. And we have tort rules of liability, we have malpractice, we have a lot of lawsuits right now in the court system for, chatbots that have recommended suicide or enabled suicide. We have self-driving cars that are, creating accidents. And we have a lot of lawsuits and so forth. I mean, one way of, trying to hold companies accountable would be simply to create rather robust tort, contractual malpractice liability? If someone's going to have their chat system practicing medicine, hold them liable for malpractice when they give bad advice. My question is, would that be a good sort of primary paradigm for regulating AI, sort of relying primarily upon normal legal principles of respondeat superior, holding principals responsible for the actions of their agents, and considering the AI agents? Mariana, for you, you talked about this image of the Tower of Babel, and you also talked about the op-ed in the New York Times this morning. I believe you were talking about the op-ed by Matthew Walthers. He also talked about the Tower of Babel. He said, the text begins with the arresting image of the Tower of Babel, perhaps the greatest biblical symbol of technological hubris. But Pope Leo seems to miss the point of the story, which is not that the tower's builders should have been more ethical by incorporating feedback from a more disparate assemblage of stakeholders. The moral was, don't build it. And so, you invoked the Tower of Babel.
I know.
I'm wondering why you didn't follow Matthew Walthers, who I think describes himself as an AI doomer, to the logical conclusion of the Tower of Babel story. John, for you, you said something that I agree with. I think it's very important. AI is not alive, it is not sentient. And I sometimes distinguish between AI, actual intelligence, or actual human intelligence, from AI, artificial intelligence. And I wanted to ask you how you would distinguish those two things. What's the difference between actual human intelligence and artificial intelligence? That's part one. Part two is, what's the difference between human being and artificial intelligence? The reason I ask that is I sometimes think that we equivocate too quickly between artificial intelligence and human intelligence, as if what we are as human beings is an intelligence, when maybe what we are as human beings is something much different than an intelligence. And so maybe even if artificial intelligence is quite like human intelligence, which I don't believe, maybe human beings are quite different than artificial intelligence. And I was thinking about this because I've been thinking a lot about AI. I'm on this AI working group. And then last week I was in Rwanda and I went on a gorilla track and I just spent a couple hours staring into the eyes of gorillas as close as I am to you. And I thought, you know what? Sentient beings are really different. And this is a much more meaningful type of interaction with another of God's creatures that really seemed intelligent and like alive and like looking me in the eye and treating me like another sentient human being than I was ever likely to get from any form of artificial intelligence. And that's something that's not quite human. I mean, I think a gorilla is quite different than humans. But it made me think about artificial intelligence in a very different way. So one question for each of you. David?
I want to answer these two questions.
Is our legal system up to the task? Do we have to invent something new, or can we just use the tools we have and just use them well?
Yeah, a very challenging question. For neither of us is this our area of law that you're asking, out of fairness here, Brett, here. So,
David, that hasn't stopped you. I mean, you began your presentation by saying you are an expert in all three of the papers that we have today.
It is not my area of law here. So let me make two adjacent comments on this. First, of what the Pope said, there are two things related to corporations, these corporations, and the impact of AI that he really lifted up. One was the obligation of governments, both domestic governments and international structures, to impose rules and regulations on these corporations. Here, the implication being, although he did not get into that they can cause harm and they need to be held accountable. He was very clear about accountability. It is very difficult as a new area of law develops here to prove the cause and effect of the harm done. That makes this a murky area of tort law. Here, it will take a while for the patterns of this to be worked out by the court. So the answer clearly is no. We're not equipped right now to really make a clear, obvious answer of, sure, this follows a pattern of A, B, and C. We just take that and place it over. There's something different about this. There really is. And I appreciated, the comment, this is like the internet. It's just there. Here, it can be neutral, or like electricity. It's just there. It can be used for good. It can be used for evil. It's just there. But what makes this different, is the capability of this agentic capability, where instead of figuring out a way to achieve the goals we tell it to achieve, it can set its own goals and completely change what an initial question or query might have been, to leave us with something else entirely, and to have entirely different sets of goals. We've really never faced anything quite like that about this. And the Pope was very clear about the corporate lives. The other thing he was absolutely clear about is workers, that we had to act affirmatively, assertively, almost aggressively, to protect workers in the jobs they have, and to talk about something more than retrain workers. To have that, workers have heard so much about, we've lost all this manufacturing in America, we're going to retrain you into new professions that are high-tech professions. And the notion that they're going to be retrained, the manufacturing blue-collar workers of America, into a new form of the economy that has the benefits and pensions and protections that the manufacturing sector had for several generations in America, is just unrealistic, and they know it. It's one of the reasons that the millions felt left behind. We're looking to make America great again, to go back to that, even though we may believe it's impossible to get back there. So the workers, and let me just mention the Pope's words on the corporations here. When such power is concentrated in the hands of a few, it tends to become opaque and evade public oversight, increasing the risk of distorted forms of development that give rise to new dependencies, new exclusions, new manipulations, and new inequalities. Here, that's what we face right now. We don't know the answer, how the rule of law actually will be applied here. Here, it is the belief it must be applied. They have to be held accountable. That will require new forms of doing it. And there are lawyers working on some of the answers to your questions now, just as we're looking for benchmarks from the faith community. I think within 5 years from now, we will have answers to those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I think it really is significant that Leo took his name from Pope Leo XIII, largely due to his Rerum Novarum, the 1896, I think, encyclical, 1891, which was really about the rights of workers in response to the Industrial Revolution. And so I think this is self-consciously a echo or a iteration of that in response to this new digital revolution. And to me, it was one of the things that was really interesting about this document, David, which you just pointed out, is the big emphasis on workers, because there's a lot of other dimensions of AI, like deep fakes, risks to children, a lot of other things which are mentioned, but there's a heavy emphasis on workers in this document, which I think echoes the rerum novarum emphasis.
I think that's
and I
right.
think that's
That's absolutely
something
right.
which is noteworthy about this particular encyclical that comes out of the Vatican right now.
I think he's very sensitive to what I was saying before. Structurally, millions and millions of people have been left to fall through the cracks with no real path to get them to a place of the dignity of work remaining a central part of their life that the Pope is very concerned about. And he's saying this time, we've got to get it right. It can't just be rhetoric. We have to get it right.
And when I saw that, I was thinking about the response of college graduates to these graduation speakers who are talking about AI. And it may be that these are college students who have used AI through their entire college careers, and they realize how little they've learned and how much AI has actually done and how little they may have, how much AI can do of what they have learned. And they may have reason to view that they are replaceable because they've actually had AI do everything that they were supposed to be doing as students. So I don't know, but it's interesting that the students graduating are much more negative about AI than maybe people of, let's say, our generation, the people that are probably in this room. Mariana, why are you not for tearing down let's not build it?
Well, it's interesting that you should bring this up. I've been writing a series of articles for Public Square magazine on AI. And the very first one that I wrote ended with the Tower of Babel. So when I read that in the Magnifica Humanitas, I was like, well, yay, we're thinking on the same path here. The reason why I say don't tear it down is because it is a tool, and it is a wonderful tool when it's used correctly. And so the whole emphasis here, I will use my wonderful husband as an example. My husband's been involved with AI for 50 years. He was with IBM Research and then Microsoft Research. And it's been interesting too, because I see what he's doing. He's a computational linguist. He uses it in translation, specifically focusing on low resource languages. And so the work that he's doing is to help. He's right now working in Africa and trying to help these African tribes that they can't communicate with the outside world because they don't have the language, they don't have the translation, they don't have the equipment. But to be able to use AI, LLMs, to be able to construct these kinds of translations, how wonderful is that?
But then why is the Tower of Babel a useful metaphor? I mean, the Tower of Babel is not a metaphor for a useful tool.
Well, they're building, and a building is useful. But I think that the fact that God was not a part of it was actually an anti-God activity that they were trying to do. And so the whole emphasis, as I read it in the Magnifica Humanitas, is that it's God and love. That needs to be in the essence of what we're doing. And if we take AI and use it as a tool, if we take AI to not make it advance inequality, but instead to increase the quality of everyone's lives, then AI becomes a positive tool that I believe that faith people and God himself might be behind. But as a tool of destruction, or I'm better than you, or we get back to this serfs and lords of the manor, which is a real concern, especially when we talk about what's going to happen to people and their jobs. That's a Tower of Babel situation.
Okay, thanks. John, actual intelligence versus artificial intelligence.
Sure, just to get to some specifics, and I'm not a lawyer either, so enjoy any of this, but it's a lot easier to say, I built something, I don't know what it's doing, I'm going to call it black box, it's not my fault, than to say, I am liable for what I built. We don't build cars in society and say, it could explode, you know, and release it to the general public and after people die. I mean, you know, I'm not sure about the first types of cars. But I want to make this clear is that working with IEEE, which I'm honored to do, I learned very early on that engineers, systems engineers, data scientists, we stand on the shoulders of giants in the faith community. For people, the joke I have about the elevator is, do I want to ride in an elevator created by engineers or by philosophers? I choose engineers, right? But I'm not trying to be funny except to say that when people build systems and they understand how it works, that exactitude comes from a testing that's not about good or bad. It's just an accountability based on certification that leads to trust. That's all it is. Marshall McLuhan, who's my favorite media theorist and also a Catholic, by the way, he converted after however many years, has the phrase you've heard, the medium is the message. We have to be, and I say this, Mariana dealt with this when we had our conversations, please don't just say AI. It is a series of tools, and you asked about intelligence. Please remember that all AI systems are built on the human data that they access. So in one sense, anything you prompt is actually human intelligence, aggregated by a tool that's biased. And if you examine the bias, the answers can be very helpful. But to move away from this positive and negative or evil or whatever, or also intelligence, is to clarify when you go to the source code of these books, you don't have to agree with them, but if you open them up and it says copyright 1920, written by this lawyer, you can at least hold it in your hands and say this is viscerally true, this is ground truth, right? And indemnification and liability are legal terms, which again, I believe are about care for the user. We can move it away from good or evil and just say, would you give your kid a bike and not teach them how to ride it? You teach them. Anyway, to get to your question more exactly, and maybe I'm trying to touch on it. One thing, just to talk about standards. Soft governance is what IEEE standards are normally called, where they have their value like we created the Wi-Fi standard. First of all, because they're technologically interoperable. The discussion of good or evil sort of moves to the side when you're like, this doesn't work, I can't get online. Then you have to make it physically work, right? So that's one reason standards are effective. But then we chose with the 7,000 series of standards to create things that we felt were, and again, I'm speaking for myself, but in general, moral lines that, you know, everyone agrees with, children. We have a whole series of standards focused on age-appropriate design. It is not mandating what any individual should do with their kids or as caregivers. It is saying these are ways to protect the agency, the personal data, and the data interoperability of all humans. And it's a foundational way to learn about AI because no AI exists outside of personal data. Also speaking about intelligence is simply sometimes kind of the mundane aspects of AI that people don't think about. One thing is procurement. We have a standard about AI procurement because the actual purchase of the SaaS tools, now largely agentic, come from the people who are like, I was given $2,000 to buy something about AI, I have no idea what it is. And they put it into their companies. And with agentic AI, especially with Mythos coming from the Claude situation, there's all these cybersecurity dangers that really are just about cybersecurity risk. So I say this because you're asking about intelligence. A lot of it is sort of common sense, right? And also saying if caregiving is the priority, it doesn't mean you're trying to hinder anything. It means you're prioritizing care. And then the last thing I'll make sure to point out is that I am a proud member of the Screen Actors Guild, because I was an actor in New York for years. And I'm a proud member of the Authors Guild. I am exhausted with the conversations about, oh, John's sad because someone might prefer the writing of Gen AI more than me. Sure, but I knew that 10 years ago. And as an actor, you subjectively liking my performance or not is up to you. As a union actor and as a union author, what happened when Claude and Anthropic, and this is on their website. Now, if you're going to say, oh, John's a doomer, that's not right. Please don't use that framing. I'm saying what you can look on the Anthropic court case on their website is a couple of years ago they decided they needed to train their large language models, and they accessed 7 million authors' books, 2 of mine, without permission, without consent, without remuneration, and trained their large language models, commonly known as Claude. And they have what, a $280 billion valuation. How much of that money have I seen? That would be zero. Maybe eventually, as the court case works out, $3,000 for each of my books. Do I seem angry or passionate? And by the way, if there are people shaking their head in the audience who know more about the case than I do, I'm not trying to be disrespectful to Anthropic per se, because now there's a judge, his name is Judge Alsup, he called this about a year ago a transformative use of original copyrighted information, because the logic was it didn't plagiarize as plagiarize used to be named. Here, let me back away from any sort of anger about Anthropic and say, I wish, I'm just going to say what I wish, that they'd come to me in an email. It could have been an email to 6 million authors. Dear author, we would like to use your books and this transformative new technology to help teach the world about how to use these amazing tools. We will do our best to watermark or create some kind of thing that will let people know in some small way when they prompt that your book was used some way in their response. We may or may not be able to give you money, but maybe we will. But what do you think? Can we use your book? You want to know what I probably would have said? I would have said, oh my gosh, that sounds awesome. Yes, 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 thank you. So the reason that I get passionate about it is almost less about what Anthropic did in one sense, except to say, well, you did this. You made a choice to access my book, which was my lifeblood for 4 or 5 years. My first book was an homage to my dad, Hacking Happiness. And you used it without getting permission. And from a faith-based perspective, again, I'd rather focus on what's the opportunity for any brand and for Anthropic and large language model companies is to say, if we're going to train from the corpus of human data accessed without their full consent or knowledge, maybe we can ask for their permission and if they'd want us to use their tools, our data.
Let's open it to the floor. We have a roving microphone, and let's start with a hand there. So.
I'm Mohammed Dilibieri, originally from Texas, but currently the Chief External Affairs Officer for Islamic Relief USA. I had a question about workers. So that's the largest number of people that will probably be directly impacted in the short term by AI and the transformations in our economy that you've covered. What specific policies are you recommending that the faith community actually push out there into the political scene as elections unfold over the next, I guess, 1, 2, 3 years?
Thanks. Yeah, please.
My question for David. Oh, I'm sorry. Thanks. My question for David is just thinking out a few years, when it comes to regulating AI, wouldn't it ultimately require that it's regulated in multiple countries? And wouldn't those countries all have to ultimately agree? That seems a pretty daunting task, right?
Yeah. John can respond to that.
Let's see, Renata in back.
Thank you. I'm Renata Wietz. The funny accent is Hungarian. I have a question to all of you on the panel. And this would go to the new encyclical, and especially the strong emphasis on truth being a common good. I would really like, if you could, to connect how you would connect this panel to the first panel, and especially the emphasis in the encyclical on participation in democratic processes, both in the truth and democracy section and also in the subsidiarity section. So that means humans actually meeting and discussing with each other things that matter to us all.
Did you ever have that? Oh, okay, here.
On the question of where the information is coming from, I've been asking this in a lot of different places, which is, should we now be less consumers of information and more producers just to get it into the pipeline, into the system, so that we do feel more represented? Does that even matter? I mean, I don't know if that's technically even that's the issue, but my concern is just if it's aggregating information, should we be busy buddying ourselves into putting that information out there so we're not misrepresented?
Take one or two more, and then we'll give our panelists an opportunity to respond collectively.
Hi, I'm Dr. Benjamin Lutz. I'm the chair of the Y20, the Youth 20, and this is one of the really big conversations that the young people across the G20 are talking about. Actually, all 3 panels are 3 of the 5 tracks that will be at the Y20 in August of this year. I don't really have a question. I just wanted to make everyone in the room aware that of the many other engagement groups, the Y20, I'm right next to the chair of the W20, are finding ways to try to collaborate. Since the G20 this year is ignoring us, I'll be very polite on the choices to not include the engagement groups more widely. So just thank you for your thoughts on this panel. And just know that on August 14th this year, the Y20 communique, or our policy document, will be shared that has a significant section on AI, as well as food and health, energy, innovation and transformation, global economy, and peace and security. Thanks.
Thank you. This is just to follow up on Rick's question here about the need to have large groups of nations agreeing to things. What about the military? What about the military side of it? I mean, we've got these conflicts. The military wants to use artificial intelligence for weapons. And we saw here Anthropic, which is stealing everyone's books. They are the good guys who say you can't use our artificial intelligence to select targets and go out and kill people. How do you so you got the breadth on the one hand, and then you got the depth, as it were, of your own open competition militarily, which could be the future of humanity. Sounds pretty tough to handle.
Good question. All right. Looks like we have a set of about 5 questions. Who would like to start?
I'll just make a couple of quick comments, and then I would love to hear from both John and David. When you talk about jobs, it's been very interesting to see, like I said, we've all had graduations, those of us that are professors and working at universities. We've seen our wonderful students go off into the world. Many of them are going off into the world without jobs. And it's been interesting to see how difficult and how concerned so many of our university students who assumed after 4 years it would be easy for them to find a job, and finding out it's not easy. And so I would say when we talk about what's going to happen with jobs, I too am concerned. I'm looking at what would be the possibility. So much has been talked about retraining, but what does retraining mean? And what are we retraining them to do exactly? And so as we look at this and we think of what happened during the Industrial Revolution in terms of how many people were out of a job and how it did completely hurt society until there was a change. And so it is something I'm concerned about, and I still feel like we have not figured it out yet. We have not figured it out. I think one of the main things that we have to do, those of us who are in education at the university and below, in terms of, I'm talking all the way from kindergarten up, we need to be able to teach them how to use these tools in an ethical and positive way. That we need to be able to have something in a curriculum that enables them, by the time they're finished in their educational pursuits, to be able to have real skills that enable them to have a job, but also real skills in terms of how to be human as well, that they don't lose the humanity because of the tools. In terms of this idea of coming together, I would say that there are so many different, IEEE, I hope that you talk a little more about what they're doing, John. But I would also say the UN is really trying hard to see what they can do in this area of bringing nations together and talking about this. And like I said, there's going to be the AI summit that's going to be happening on July 6th and 7th in Geneva. And the whole purpose of that is to try to figure out some kind of international policy group that would have a huge buy-in by all nations. Do I think that's really going to happen? No. But at least the conversation is there. And that's what we need. We need more conversations. And then finally, I just wanted to say in terms of the military, I was at the Future of Life recently, had a large summit get together. And it was very interesting when I was there because there were a couple of people from the Pentagon that were also at this meeting. And it was fascinating to talk to one man in particular who had been at the Pentagon and then he left because he was so frustrated with what was happening and some of the thoughts and feelings about autonomous weapons and the use of AI and weaponry. And it was really interesting to talk to him in terms of his ideas because he had been with the Pentagon for 30 years. And I have to admit, I feel very strongly exactly the way Pope feels and what he wrote about in terms of what we need to also put pressure on in terms of our government to make sure that what we want happens, especially when we talk about the military and the way things are being used. So.
I struggle with talking too much, then also like elephants in the room stuff. I've been in these conversations for 10 to 12 years, and my wife, Gabrielle, has this phrase she used called hand on knee, which to calm down, because my passion comes off as anger. But IEEE, the thing I love about IEEE is I learned about the nature of consensus formally and interdisciplinarity, which I think the faith-based community can leverage more than maybe anyone else. On a previous panel, the logic of coming together and agreeing is not what consensus is. It's talking through, at least in IEEE, standards projects that I've been a part of, they take years. And it feels like, oh, we're going too slow, technology is going too fast. But the speed of consensus means that when you release something, more people will use that soft governance or standard. And they've come to agreement even if they don't agree on every last thing. We have a consensus logic that if you have a committee of like 50 people, at some point disagreements will come to the point where you have to vote on something. And you have a majority vote. And whatever the consensus percentage is, some people will be unhappy, some people will be excited. But the logic is you move forward. So consensus and interdisciplinarity, the other thing we learned specifically with AI is we were at a conference in Austin after working for a year on the first draft of this big document. And I've been in conversations defining artificial intelligence, the term, the ontological definition, the philosophical definition, the engineer definition, the marketing definition, where within one vertical, the people that come up with an agreement, you go, yeah, that's the definition. And then you bring in a lawyer, for instance. And they're like, what are you talking about? You didn't mention indemnification. And it seems like it's hard, but in one sense it's not. When you bring together a lot of different people and you keep asking the question, who's not in the room? And usually it's things like women, people of color, indigenous, people from the global majority. And I'm not trying to be political. I don't know what that term would mean in this sense. When you release something that's as complex as a tool and you tell someone this is AI, it has a mysticism, which again, the medium is the message. Removing the mysticism means teaching people, here's how this particular tool works. And then saying, did we have enough people testing this, they call it red teaming with Gen AI, to sort of understand how it works. Let me give you an example. When Alexa went into millions of people's homes and accessed personal data, one thing that happened is it was released using a woman's voice. So if you know human-computer interaction, or HCI, it's simply the study of how humans interact with tools. And we haven't talked about embodied robotics, which is going to be a big deal in about a year. Think about Gen AI hallucinations, don't like that term, but in a robot. Kind of scary. Anyway, Alexa came out with a woman's voice, and hundreds of thousands of kids went to school over the next months globally and yelled only at their female teachers because they'd been trained at home. Trained. Hey, how do I ask Alexa whatever? Do this. Say, Alexa, whatever. And they went and they mainly yelled at their female teachers because they'd been trained to yell at a box that had a female voice. Now, is this good or bad? Is this whatever? The answer is, I'm not trying to demonize Amazon. They probably didn't have enough women, or they probably didn't test enough, or they didn't think about it. I don't think about a lot of things. I don't want to be a hypocrite. But that's good design. Responsible design is prioritizing the metrics of people and planet at the outset of design. And we talked about intelligence before. I also want to be clear, I'm not trying to demonize Anthropic, if it sounds like I am. I want to be clear that large language models, the industry, again, is one type of AI application. And the analogy I'll give is like, what if right now a new type of motor came out and everyone's like, this motor for my car is awesome. It's awesome. I love this motor. And someone else was like, cool. Do I still drive my car? Or what about the electricity or gas that powers it? Large language models, right, didn't remove deep learning, didn't remove machine learning, didn't remove probabilistic computing. And especially we haven't talked enough, in my opinion, about hyperscale data centers and understanding the compute needs of the specific types of Gen AI. I'm not trying to demonize Gen AI, but to pull massive large language models in aggregate to get an analysis of a prompt uses a lot more energy and water than other types of Gen AI. So there's a new movement or type of methodology called frugal AI, which is not anti-AI or anti-Gen AI, but it asks, what are you trying to do? What's the best tool? May not even be AI. Measuring aquifer depletion oftentimes means sensors. And by the way, we are sitting in what's called Data Center Alley. Virginia is the biggest proliferation of data centers on the planet. And if you don't know about the Potomac water basin, the aquifer is shrinking pretty rapidly. So measure it. That's my recommendation, because the thing we also haven't talked about is systems thinking and bioregionalism, where it may not sound like it's connected, but when you say AI, to me, you're saying this whole world of things, that the clarity of saying, what do you mean by it, is not just for me to be annoying, but is it the infrastructure, is it the personal data, or is it the tools in terms of how they output?
Let's give David a minute to have a final word here.
Well, very quickly then. First, on the worker piece of it. This is one of the great unknowns. I tried to make the argument earlier that we failed miserably on this in terms of earlier transformations in the technology that's led to the loss of jobs in the global economics that has led to the loss of jobs. What the Pope is saying is it can't be business as usual. We have to prioritize protecting workers in a way we've not done before, because otherwise this may be a permanent shift that will leave a significant proportion of the world out of the dignity of work and everything that comes with that. The question of individual country standards, right now that describes what the copyright world is like. There are lots of different countries holding different standards. And over the years, we've worked out whose law will apply in which situations. There's a modus operandi about it. On this one, I think there's a recognition that the UN or some other ad hoc coalition of entities needs to really look for international standards that will bind most of the countries involved. Just to make a geopolitical observation, here, whether we're talking about workers or we're talking about standards here, or we're talking about climate change here, if China and the United States cannot get together and actually work out a modus operandi on almost every one of these issues, we're in deep trouble anyway. Here, everything we're going to do is going to get thwarted about it. And they can be a leader in the rest of the world, with Russia and India and other major players coming in, the EU coming into play on this. But it really requires that change of that. And if we're talking realpolitik again, if there's going to be governance on any of this, we need to recapture something that has been tragically lost in America. If you think about the 20th century, it's hard to think of a single social achievement that did not happen because of a bipartisan coalition of decency on Capitol Hill. Here, that has been shattered. And whatever you may think about President Trump's policy, his style of retribution politics has driven out exactly that segment of the Republican Party that might be the bridge to find common ground between the two parties. This remains a central challenge for us, and it kind of begins with what the outcome of the next election is, and what the Democrats, together with the handful of moderate Republicans left here, are willing to do here. and that's a whole nother issue for us. The military issue, that I'm glad someone named that, I will simply say that that is the area in which the technology runs risk running ahead before we can get control more than any other way. It isn't just the competition between China and the United States and between the companies, which is a driving force to move too quickly anyway, but it is the military use of it that they know that none of them are waiting and they're moving. And again, that will require a Congress and legislative bodies that are really prepared to put controls and limitations on some of this, and we aren't there. And hopefully, the faith community can help spur that. Just one other quick note. I was really glad. I think you mentioned in the paper the Article 18 Alliance and what the possibility of AI's contribution to religious freedom is. You won't be surprised that that's something I would bring up in this context. But the ability of AI to help catalog and categorize and educate about and promulgate information about holy sites and the religious heritage of every group in a country, including minority religious groups in a country, predictive models looking at what are the indicators of ethnic and religious violence, and where can we get red light warnings about it before it happens in order to get the international community to intervene. There's a whole range of ways to think about the contribution AI can make to religious freedom as well here. And I'll conclude just by saying Tower of Babel, I think, as I understand it, the sin was not in the building. It was building unwilling to live within the limits of what humanity has here on the earth, that God's creation that we've been asked to till and to tend, to care for here, but to reach up to the heavens itself, to change our, and it's exactly the model we're worried about in terms of what the proper role of AI is, and the ability it in itself could decide to go somewhere that we never intended it to go with here, with no choice than either dismantle it, or you're going to be facing consequences you can't imagine. I think the better image, though, of legends and stories here is for Jews, the story of the golem in 16th century Prague, who was created by Rabbi Judah Loew, here, a Frankenstein creature here, built out of clay, and then was activated by his taking the name of God written on a tablet and puts it in the mouth of the golem, and sets certain rules, including the observance of all the mitzvot. So the Sabbath, the golem rests. And at some point, the golem on his own breaks away from that, violates it, creates chaos, damaging not just those who threaten Jews, protecting them, but the Jewish community as well. And he has to pull out the guidance, the rules, the regulations. It pulls it out from his mouth to end his doing it. Or better yet, Samson, here, a dedicated Nazarite here, who forgot the source of his sanctification and his leadership that God had charged him with. Here, allows his strength to be taken away from him, is captured by his enemy, blinded here, and in the end realizes that the only way that he can destroy his enemies is by destroying himself as well. Here, and it's a crucial warning at this moment in history for America, I would say, for Israel, for other countries, about the power, the danger of power, and used, but with moral blindness at times. And I don't just mean Israel, it applies to every terrorist group, it applies to many of the enemies of Israel as well here. But that idea of power without vision here, to me, is one of the central challenges that we face, and it's one of the reasons I think the Pope named the idea beginning, which I think should go further, but with weapons here, that there must be standards, moral standards, that only human beings can bring to bear on that category of man's creation.
Thank you. Well, certainly when human beings try to take it upon ourselves to become godlike and to take God's power into our own hands, whether it's trying to reach heaven through our own aspirations ourselves, or to create a being where we pretend to be God, to create godlike creations. And we see AI creators who imagine themselves to be creating deities. That type of hubris usually does not end well. And so there are a lot of cautionary tales out there about that. I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking our panel in just a minute, but I'd like to conclude with paragraph 233 from Magnifica Humanitas, where Pope Leo says this: "No computational system, however sophisticated, can create a heart that gives itself, or a conscience that discerns good from evil. But even when machines excel in efficiency, a human face that asks to be gazed upon remains the center of our history. This human face is the fullness toward which history is moving." Thank you all for your participation, for your attention, and let me ask you in joining me in thanking our panel.